This is Shop Talk with writers.
On life and art, what I wanted to also say was that, of course, life and art and the way that they intertwine is so intrinsic to the Bloomsbury Group and particularly to Charleston. And that's, I think that was so exploring my own questions of life and art. I think that's what drew me to that situation where really they were trying to create a sort of living art or, an art that was fully entwined with life. And so their lives reflected their art and their art reflected their lives and they were living in a new way. And so I think that's a really important part of that reflection on life and art.
And how do you think they would fit into our reality today, into how we live now?
Interesting.
I'm not sure. Would they still be ahead of us or would they be old-fashioned?
I think there was certain question. I think there's a certain question about, definitely about, privilege and kind of, they were quite sort of removed from the rest of the world. And there's, things that I write about in terms of the war, how they were sort of insulated from the war and they sort of didn't really, obviously there were certain, rations and things, but they, to a certain extent, they sort of lived this separate kind of life. So I don't think that we could place them in this context because I don't think that we would, and we could still, discuss that in terms of there is this sort of, which I think Ivy feels actually, there is this sort of separation of them from the world and this sort of, this sort of closing off. And she often thinks, what would she compare them to? And interestingly, sometimes she compares them to almost to a monastery. So there is this question about, the sort of connections between a very sort of rarefied artistic environment and a sort of religious environment in the sense of trying to separate both from the world.
Hello, welcome to a new episode of Shop Talk with Writers. I'm Elena Lappin and my guest today is novelist Megan Hunter. I loved her exceptional debut novel, The End We Start From, a dystopian and poetic take on new motherhood at a time of a great social and environmental catastrophe. Her second novel, The Harpy, brilliantly dissected a broken marriage. Megan Hunter's new novel, Days of Light, is a tender, deeply moving story of love and loss in a historical setting. I was curious to talk to Megan about the connecting threads in these beautiful narratives. This podcast was recorded at the wonderful Pritchard Ure cafe and bookshop above the Camden Garden Centre in the midst of many other conversations over great food and drink and surrounded by books and art, some of it from the Virginia Woolf era Megan took her inspiration from for this novel. Enjoy.
My name's Megan Hunter, and I'm going to read from my new novel, my third novel, Days of Light. Just to set the scene a little bit, we start with our main character, Ivy, who's 19 and lives with her bohemian family of artists in a house in the countryside. And she's just waking up in the morning. Day 1, Easter Sunday, 1938. When Ivy looked back, this was what she remembered. Joseph was singing. Here was a rare thing her brother couldn't do. His voice was tuneless, rambling, reaching for a note as though for a high ledge on a mountain. But the fact remained, Joseph, their own plain, sensible Joseph, was singing. He lay in his bed in the next room, the painted walls sentinel around him, his window ajar, already wafting sweetness. He was opening his wide lips, feeling the vibration build in his stomach, rise into his chest. Here was music, in his throat, on his tongue, whistling through his teeth. Ivy held her own breath to try to hear the song more clearly. It was a low, almost continuous sound, a bird on a summer night, an anonymous, homeless tone, the sound of yearning itself. Ivy pictured Joseph in his set at Oxford, the two little rooms with their air of adolescent disarray, his girlfriend a shape at the edges. Their father, Gilbert, had given him a gramophone for his 21st birthday, and surely Joseph would dance his girl around the study, taking care not to bump into the clumsy armchairs, the solemn wooden desk. Joseph was a good dancer. He would have his arm wrapped around her waist. Ivy could see the waist. its deep dip of invitation, its stretch into arm and shoulder. But above this was a blur. Joseph had never described this girl much beyond her name, Frances, and just once, after dinner and wine, lovely. Over time, Ivy had filled this blur with figures, a girl leaning to pick up a penny, rising like a child who has stamped her gumboots into a puddle with a loose opening smile. Or a more serious woman wearing a beret at an angle, a cigarette tucked between her fingers, lips poised with experience. Sometimes the figure was simple, even incestuous, herself or her mother. Ivy did not berate herself for this. After all, after today, these figures would vanish forever. Today, the real Frances would visit for Easter. Through her open window, Ivy could smell the goodness of the garden outside, the truth of another morning arriving. The birds made their expectant, nervous morning calls. Even they knew about this day, Ivy felt. They sensed its particular quality, how even at Cressington, the most secular house in England, Mother once called it, Easter meant something. It meant something to the trees and to the greying statues of the garden, their subtle turns only children could see. When Ivy was 6 or 7, she had watched the small nymph by the pond turn and wink at her. It was perhaps the single most significant moment of her childhood. Magic proven, the shell of reality cracked. But when she tugged hard on her mother's skirts, Marina only said, "Of course, darling," and moved away. Ivy heard a noise from the kitchen below her. Anne would have been up for hours, taking the lamb from the larder, covering it with salt and herbs, hoping to disguise the way the air had already dried the meat a little. It would be a warm Easter, the newspapers said, using that word unseasonable. But wasn't Easter always sunny? Ivy closed her eyes, felt a threaded seam of past Easter Sundays, those when they had eaten in the drawing room and in the garden room and in the garden itself, an image of sunlight through a tablecloth. She must have sat under the table as a child, been passed morsels of meat by Joseph or Angus, a head patted like a dog. The sunlight seemed thinner in memory, a different colour even, more lemon, lighter than the dense peach that hung around her now. She turned on her back, lifted her nightdress over her head and breathed her own morning smell. She was like a farm, she often thought, so many parts working together to create the semblance of order, one shape moving through the world. The singing had stopped, but there was another noise from Joseph's room now, a clunk and a creak, as though he had left his bed and then thought better of it, turned back against the cruel gravity of the painted wall. Sometimes in the night she heard him snoring, a steady whinny that reminded her of a horse, the way breath came warm through their deep nostrils, their long, patient exhalations. She was usually up before Joseph, but she wondered now if he had woken even earlier than she had, enjoying the quiet of himself, the smell of the garden rising towards him. But here the singing began again. There was something unformed and tender in his voice, a tone she had not heard since his childhood, in his offerings of worms or mud pies, the sudden wail of his disagreement at the dinner table. She thought of his hair as it used to be, the monkish circle of brown that often fell in his eyes. He was always bigger than Ivy, always 2 years ahead, but now she remembered him coltish, fawn-like. She remembered the soft skin of his arms, the tangle of his legs on the privy when he left the door open. And now he was in love, the prospect of love still more potent in the face of likely war, Joseph their golden boy, the only son. This vacation Ivy had looked for love on her brother. Not only looked, she felt for it, when she thought he might not notice, resting her hand casually on his scalp or forearm until he batted it away. She thought she might feel love in his skin, that it might give his hairy arms or bony knees some new softness, a feminine grace. She had wondered even before he arrived if he would smell different, if his voice would fall in a different key. And now, here it was at last, the clear signal, not a sight or a touch, but a sound after all. He was singing.
Megan Hunter, welcome to Shop Talk with Writers, and thank you so much for joining us here. We are recording this interview, this conversation, in a wonderful gallery cafe slash bookshop. It's called Pritchard Ure, and it's on a sort of upper level of the Camden Garden Centre. So the sounds that we hear around us, sitting here recording this, are quite natural to this place. It's people eating, talking, drinking, looking at books, buying books, a lot of them. And I just love this place. So this podcast travels. We record as much as possible in different locations where we can sort of feel something that is natural to the author or to the book, to feel the scene in which it makes sense to talk about that particular book or their lives and the author themselves. And we were actually originally going to record this at your home in Cambridgeshire. Now, if we had done that, where would it have happened?
Yes, I have a shed in the garden in my house. It's kind of like a disguise because it looks like quite an ordinary shed from the outside. So it has, it's wooden on the outside and it's painted blue. But then when you go inside, it's like a room in a house, really. Actually, my dad and my brother kind of helped to build it with some friends of theirs who are builders as well. And it's a lovely, that's where I wrote Days of Light pretty much. And it's very quiet, although there's quite a lot of birds and there are lots of books. And my desk looks out onto the garden, sort of by the window. So I like looking out and sort of having some sort of view. But actually, I usually sit on the sofa, which also faces the window. But I find also I don't have any Wi-Fi. So the only internet I have is connected to the wall. So at the desk, I'm connected to the internet, in theory. But on the sofa, there's no internet at all. And that I find that a much more productive, less distracting place. And it's also nice and comfortable, and I can kind of have all my books around me. So I actually usually write on the sofa.
And these are your books, as opposed to maybe family books, or these are your specific books that you particularly love?
No, these are my books, and they are the books that I guess are the most connected to my work. I have more books in the house. I have a sort of always have a sort of slightly horrible teetering pile of books by my bed and sort of in my bed and, my dressing table. And my whole house is sort of obviously bursting with books. But I sort of call it the studio, which sounds a bit fancy. But in the studio or the shed, I have, my kind of the books that are most connected to my work. And I do this thing actually where I finish working for the day and then I take all the books that I'm sort of reading back into the house, and I hardly ever then read them in the house, but I just kind of carry them around. So I have all these tote bags. Anyway, this is all sounding a bit kind of crazy, but it's important to me to kind of have and I get quite anxious if I can't find a book, so I have a sense of my own sort of filing system.
I don't have any system in my house. Okay. I know some people have, alphabetic or historical or whatever, period, theme, color. I have no system because my non-system is if I want a book, I will find it. Yeah. And in the process of finding it, I stumble upon other books, which I probably wouldn't have noticed otherwise. So that leads me then, to other readings. And I think that's fun. Yeah. So you sound like
It's not, when I said filing system, that was a massive exaggeration because actually I do have in my studio, I have nonfiction, poetry, and then I have various sections of fiction, and I have the one closest to my desk is kind of like key texts for me, key books, and it's either key books of all time, or usually with each novel I have a selection of books that are kind of my key text for that novel. So those are the ones that would always be, close to my desk, and kind of like that I would actually. I do read them actually. I'm thinking about with Days of Light. I would have read bits of them. Particularly, I found for this book, as I think is probably quite obvious, Virginia Woolf was a huge inspiration, particularly to The Lighthouse and Mrs. Dalloway. And I did find it helpful to keep reading her throughout the writing of the book. And to kind of, it was a certain quality that I think her work just really helped me to kind of keep trying to bring the prose back, not to her prose. It's not sort of a direct, mimicry, I don't think, but it's a sort of like the quality that she then helped me to have in my prose. I, kind of, kept finding that. And then other books I'll just read at the beginning as sort of inspirations, and then I probably won't keep going back to them.
We'll get back to that in a second.
Yeah.
But first I'd like to say I didn't do that thing that we normally do these days. Before we meet anyone, a date, a meeting, an email, we Google everything about them. And I'm really good at that. I find out everything. Well, in this case, I decided not to do it. I didn't go. I know nothing about you.
Okay, nice.
Except I do remember that we met accidentally at a book event
a
few years ago.
Yeah, I remember
it
that.
was a novel called The Nursery by Sylvia Molnar. It was about a new mother dealing with quite a nightmare of postpartum depression and that. And at the time, we had known each other, we bumped into each other, and you said you were kind of going in the direction of film writing. So just sort of going back to your debut book briefly.
Sure.
The end we start from, a hugely successful book, very unusual book in the way it's written or was written, and made into a film, major film. I don't actually know whether you were involved in the film itself. But this novel, so between that novel and Days of Light, there was another novel called The Harpy. I sense that each time you write a book, it almost feels as if a different author has written it.
Yes.
I don't know if you feel that way, but can you tell me what the sort of connecting thread is between or among them all?
Well, I mean, I would say a connecting thread is, a really strong emphasis on the sentence and on language and on sort of poetic qualities of fiction. So I think that was obviously, very evident, hopefully, in the first book, because it's almost written like a poem. You could call it a prose poem, maybe, or sort of poetic novella, or. And then I think from there it was kind of like, what other ways do I want to tell a story? But within the novel form, because I suppose after that I thought, what am I going to do next? But I definitely felt like I wanted to keep writing novels and keep writing stories. But it didn't seem as though I didn't personally feel it was the right thing to repeat the same form for another story. I did kind of try, to be honest, because I'm like, it worked.
Did you?
Yeah, it worked the first time, So I did sort of have a few goes, but it never felt right to use the same form. I wrote an essay, sort of poetic, lyrical essay, short story thing that was published in the White Review called Out of My Hands. I think it's probably the closest thing to a continuation of that form. And possibly I'll return to, that sort of fragmentary form at some point. But it did feel like that form was particular to that story, because it's, a mother and her new baby, and they're sort of, on the move, they're on the run, they're sort of, not on the run exactly, but they're traveling around to different places to find shelter. She can only sort of, not that we think necessarily she's writing this exactly, but her thoughts are very scattered. They're very, she hasn't got much time, and that's the voice that I developed for that story. So it didn't feel quite doable, really, to use that same voice, that same form for another story. So I think The Harpy is a sort of evolution of that voice, but it was, it was different, and it had sort of perhaps a slightly more conventional shape. And then again, Days of Light, that's very much, I suppose with that, the question is, I'm writing a period novel, a historical novel, and almost developing a historical voice to go with that historical novel. So it's sort of situating the prose also in the past, in a sense. So it's not just writing about the past with a sort of modern voice.
And sort of filling in the blanks, where did you grow up and how did you become, who were you before you were a novelist or poet as well?
So I actually grew up in the place where I live now. in the countryside in outside Cambridge. And I spent some time in America as a child. And I kind of had a very clear goal, actually, to be a writer as a teenager. I had a wonderful, encouraging teacher, Mr. Durran. Shout out, Mr. Durran.
Yeah.
James Durran. And he was amazing. And I wrote sort of the school play, and I wrote stories, and I was very set on that, actually. But then I think sometimes what can happen, I don't know, it happened to me, is when you're very clear about what you want when you're young, and then sometimes you sort of, it's almost too early to have figured that out, and I mean, obviously some people do carry on and publish when they're very young, but for me it was more of a sort of wiggly waggly journey. So I went to university and I did English. And I think for me, studying English, I loved it. And I thought at one point I wanted to be an academic in English literature, but I think I was quite intimidated by, and I was sort of so awed, by writers like Virginia Woolf, Samuel Beckett, and these writers. And I sort of felt a bit like, well, I'm never going to be as good as them, so what's the point, sort of thing, very sort of youthful kind of conclusion. And the other one was, studying sort of modernist writing and, Joyce Beckett. It was a sense of, where is the novel going to go? Where can the novel go after this? So I felt a little bit sort of not silenced, but I guess I was a little bit unsure about how to write
and how to fit into that.
Yeah, how to fit into that, and what kind of writer I wanted to be. I don't think I really had any idea. I got married when I was 24, and I had 2 children in my 20s. And then actually, I haven't really talked about this before, but I've decided to talk about it as part of this book because I think it's relevant, is that I trained for a while to be a priest in the Anglican Church. So I trained for ordination when I went forward for that when I was 26. And I obviously decided not to do that. I'm not sitting here now with a dog collar and things, but it was that was a very momentous point in my life, going into that, sort of dedicating yourself to that.
And what led to that?
Well, I think when in my early 20s, when I went back to Cambridge and did a master's, I was in this church which was very kind of open, very kind of liberal, very kind of, open to the arts and open to kind of literature and ideas. And it felt like it was kind of a space that I could be in, because up until then, I don't think I hadn't really connected with Christianity. But I think I sort of, and I'd always had a sort of spiritual interest. But at that point, it became, a Christian faith. And then I was quite young, and I think, you get these sort of I was very idealistic, actually, both politically and sort of religiously as a young person. I mean, I am still idealistic, but I think, and I was very sort of, would do things sort of, I don't know, on the strength of my feelings, which I think is, is part of being young, isn't it? So I did that, but I realized that it wasn't, I mean, I had very young children at the time. I was pregnant with my daughter while I was at theological college. I had a 2-year-old. I was doing the undergraduate tripos in theology at Cambridge with a 2-year-old and a baby. So it was just incredibly intense. And I think when I left that, and then I was sort of at home with the 2 children, that was when I really came back to, who am I? What do I want to do with my life? And, sort of hilariously, I was 28 and I felt like, is my life, not obviously my life wasn't over. I had these wonderful children, but is my life sort of as a creative person over? But I was, 28, obviously. So numerous people said to me, no. And were really helpful, actually, in kind of showing me that life was still open and that there was still possibility. And I think that's a theme running through this novel, actually, is, at different points in life when you sort of feel like possibility is gone, and then you just, which has happened to me, several times in my life. And I think that was one of the times. And so I started to just write little bits of poetry, and my mum, bless her, would look after my daughter, who was a baby, and then, toddler. When I had a job too. So I had a job at the university working in administration, and I was, I had two little children. So I only had Friday mornings to write. And that's when I wrote the end we start from, was every Friday morning I'd go to this particular cafe and sort of look out on the river and write this book. slowly.
Which is a fantastic book. So the end we start from is both a very intimate story of a young mother, new mother, who is dealing with motherhood and all the challenges of that, but in the context of a flood. Would you call it dystopian? Would you call it utopian? Probably a dystopian sort of catastrophe. And in that context, things happen that she has to deal with while completely focusing on being a new mother. And as the baby grows and develops, first is born and then grows, her focus is completely on the baby and just the baby, and everything else kind of gradually at first it's in the background, and then it does overwhelm her and her relationship and her role as a mother. How do you raise a child in this context, meeting other mothers? So it was a very intimate story, but on a large canvas, but told, as you say, in these poetic fragments, which no matter how brief they are poetically so precise that they actually tell a very, very full story. And then your next novel, The Harpy, is not dystopian at all. Is it a little surreal? Maybe. But it's the story of betrayal in a marriage and a response to that, which is quite a creative response. So is it a story of revenge, or how would you describe it?
Yeah, I think it's a story. It definitely has that quality of what does it mean to try to take revenge on somebody? Is revenge possible really in this?
While not destroying them, but still staying with them.
Yeah, and it's a sort of game, and it's a sort of. But I think I sort of started with this concept of these three. So the story is that her husband has an affair, and then the wife, they agree that she's going to hurt him 3 times in revenge. So I started with that as my sort of premise, but then as I carried on writing, I feel like it sort of moved away from that. That was still the structure of the book, but it became about this quality of the harpy and about the mother, kind of the mother's selfhood, really. I think that, if, in a way, there is a through line, quite a, I suppose, clear through line in my books, in that, like, the end we start from is, a mother and a baby, and then we have in the harpy a mother and sort of primary school age children, and it's a bit like when your children are starting to get older, who are you, and sort of do we see there's some thoughts in the book about do we see mothers really as full human beings, which do we kind of really understand, and about the gender sort of politics that are still there in sort of heteronormative nuclear families. Definitely I don't think we've sort of surpassed that. And so there's all of that going on about her ambitions and his ambitions. And I'm actually adapting The Harpy now for television. So I've been writing the script, and that's been really, really interesting in terms of, I suppose, going even more in depth into that story and talking about it with lots of different people, and,
Interesting.
And exploring those qualities. And I suppose a few years on, the way that it still feels relevant, and it still feels, and that's been a really interesting kind of continuation of that narrative, really.
Can you talk a little bit about what happens when you do an adaptation of your own fiction into a screenplay or a television play?
I mean, so far I'm only at quite early stage. I've written the pilot so far, but I've found it to be a really interesting creative exercise that I've just really enjoyed. I found it extremely fun, and I think it's something for me in that I find it incredibly difficult for a book to be finished, and like for a book to be that I can never edit it ever again. So I remember with The End We Start From, I had a lot of anxiety around the final edits, and I was sort of like, eventually I read some quotes. I think it's quite a kind of sort of often quoted thing, which is that a book is never finished; it's only abandoned. I'm sorry, I can't remember who said it, but I found that reassuring, in that you can never finish, so you just have to give it to the and I think with all my books, to a certain extent, my editor slightly had to, not literally obviously, but like slightly had to be like, okay, that's it now. No more edits. Because
Is it about letting go or about feeling that it's not as good as it can be?
it's the finalization. I find that, the thought that I would then, like I was leafing through Days of Light on the train, and, the thought that I would then read a part and think, oh no, that should be different when it's already done. And I find that, there's something about kind of, the fixedness of it that I find difficult. Anyway, so with adapting your own work, all of that is shattered because you can change your book into something else, and you can add different characters, and you can add different. So I love it personally. It suits me. I know some people, they might feel the opposite, so they might, whether they're adapting or whether someone else is adapting it, find it very hard for that work that they might then see as being fixed in a reassuring way, I guess, to then be altered, and they wouldn't want it to be altered. But I quite enjoy that process of alteration.
So now Days of Light,
Yeah.
your new novel, published by Pritchard Ure, is a complete departure from the previous two, I would say. That's why I said that it sounds almost like it was written by another author, because it has a different voice to it. And it's not enough to say that it's a historical novel and that explains it, or it's not a historical novel, it has a historical setting. That's not everything. It's also about the way you approach your main character, and also the visual quality of it all. So I'd love to talk about that, but first I'd like to mention that we just walked around this bookshop, which has an antiquarian section, and it literally has the books that you have studied or read or been influenced by for this particular novel. So can you mention, because the book begins, so if I can just briefly sort of summarize your structure, and if I'm wrong, correct me, please. So it's set on 6 separate days, beginning in Easter Sunday, 1938,
Yes.
and ending in 1999. And on each of those days, we are with your main protagonist, Ivy, a 19-year-old girl in the beginning, and an much older woman. You can probably say old woman at the end. How did you, because, around here as well, there are books that were actually written at that time. There is, for example, we had on the podcast the translator of Alba de Cespedes, the Italian novelist, whose novel was published in 1936, I believe. So it had that atmosphere. You capture England with Chamberlain at the helm, and the sense of the imminent war and the Spanish War happening. You have that present in that book as well, but it was actually written at that time. How did you, writing today, how did you make yourself understand that time so that you can truthfully place your characters there and your story?
Yeah, so it was an interesting journey with Days of Light. It was quite a long journey, and I think perhaps that reflects the sense of it being a departure, and it's 5 years since my last book. I've also been through a lot of changes personally, and I think, and I'm a bit older, and there's but to go back to the genesis of the book, my sort of creative impulse was sparked by a visit to Charleston in Sussex, which was the home of particular figures in the Bloomsbury group, so particularly Vanessa Bell, Duncan Grant, Clive Bell at different points, and David Garnett, and then Vanessa Bell's children, one of whom was Angelica Garnett. And she wrote a book called Deceived with Kindness, which is about her relationship with her mother. So I had a journey of going to Charleston, kind of did this lovely festival event with another writer, Conan Jones, and was taken on this sort of nighttime tour of the house. It was very atmospheric, and I just sort of felt this really strong kind of sort of moment of recognition, almost as something sort of like there's something here I want to explore. But that was quite a while ago, I think 2018, and then I read Angelica Garnett's book, and then I sort of immersed myself in that world. So reading Vanessa, there's a fantastic biography of Vanessa Bell by Frances Spalding. called Vanessa Bell, and lots and lots of different biographies and books written by the Bloomsbury Group. And obviously, I was already a huge sort of Virginia Woolf devotee, so that was already in place. But I sort of explored more the sort of Charleston house and the art and all of the sort of lives around there. And I actually wrote a book which was a directly biographical novel about these people. So it was using their names, and it was using a draft, obviously a rough draft, but it didn't feel like it just didn't quite work. I mean, it sort of worked in a way, but it didn't quite have that sort of spark of life, and I didn't quite feel that I had the freedom that I need to feel to write fiction. And so I decided to just kind of write a book. I started completely again, and just write a book sort of inspired by, or sort of with that basis that I had in that time and that place and those kinds of people, but really feeling like I could sort of depart, because the other element of the book that I wrote before had a sort of memoir quality. Mm-hmm. So there were historical parts interspersed with writing about my own life, which was auto-fiction, I guess. It was still fiction, but it was very autobiographical. So I think I was doing something in the end that was an intersection between fiction, biography, and autobiography. And the way that ended up coming together was in this novel, which has elements of my own life. So, for example, this sort of religious vocation, it has elements that I've lived through, but it also has this basis in this sort of time and its character and these textures. And I felt that through being immersed in that world for years, it came quite naturally to me to then write. I was sort of familiar by then with that time, and with those the kind of language that they would use and the kind of atmosphere of those places.
It's very interesting because actually I find that the end we start from is much more, let's say, Virginia Woolf-esque than this novel.
Oh, interesting.
I find that this novel is really Megan Hunter.
Oh, okay. Wow,
even though you set it in that time, and it's very true to that time, in terms of the vocabulary and the setting and the behavior of the characters, but it is you. Clearly, you are the author of that narrative very, very strongly. Of course, you are the author of all these narratives, but from the point of view of the prose and the style, I feel it's very much your own. And I wouldn't have said this is actually influenced by all of these sources that you've just cited. I feel that it really comes from something that's very much your own. And I was just wondering, what is that? Because in the book we have siblings, a sister and a brother, who are very, very close. The themes you deal with. My biggest weakness in this podcast is I read these books, I live these books, I'm completely filled with these books, and I have trouble talking to the authors without actually saying too much, because I can't give anything away. And that's so annoying, because I would like to specifically ask about this and that. It's very specific, because here you are, I have questions, I've just read the book, but I can't do that. So I'm going to be vague intentionally, but understand that I would like to actually really hammer it and say, what about this, what about that? So the themes are love and death.
Yes.
Lots of sex, all kinds of sex.
True.
Faith.
Yes.
Loss of faith. It's very interesting that, as you just read in the opening pages, the house they grew up in was called or referred to by the mother as the most secular house, and it should be, because what went on in that house was extremely non-religious. The freedom with which they all sort of created these couplings very creatively, and all together, and got on very Bloomsbury, of course, but the theme of faith and death and understanding this regarding different characters, that must be something that has really touched you and preoccupied you. So I'd love to know where that comes from specifically. Is there anything that because you have some scenes in this book that I recognize from my own experience, dying parents, dying,
Yeah.
the situations around it, people dealing with death.
Yeah.
Also, your amazing from a human psychological point of view combo of death and sex on the same day.
Same day.
We mourn, we grieve. We translate that into what is the most the most alive thing we can do.
Yes.
So can we dive into that? Where does that come from?
I mean, I think it's really, what I find really interesting is that I wrote a lot of this book. So 2021 to, I need to pin this down actually. But basically I know that I wrote a lot of this book describing things in some cases that hadn't happened to me, but were going to happen to me, if that makes any sense. So I felt like the book sort of, there was a German philosopher that I studied at university who talked about how fiction overshoots reality. So it was like, it sort of overshot my own experience, but it was almost like I'm not going to say a premonition, but obviously all these things they were obviously present in my experience in some way, otherwise I wouldn't have been able to write about them, but they hadn't happened in the fullness of, so it would be family members dying, my own marriage ending, my own sort of discoveries about my own sexuality, things that were, but they took place, I suppose, in the last 5 years in which I did write and rewrite the book. So they do come into the book, but the book was already quite a lot written before those things happened. Does that make sense?
Sure,
so it was all kind of life and art,
of course,
all overlapping.
Life and art.
Yeah.
Let me find a quote. This is another thing I suck at. I make notes and then I can never find them. Okay, here you say, and this is Ivy thinking. She's always thinking. And here's a sentence that really stood out to me. There was to be a continuation of life and not only of art. So this is what this book is very much about.
Yes.
Life versus art,
Yes,
isn't it?
Yes. And I think that actually, I think that really does hit the nail on the head, because what I think I've been thinking about over the past few years a lot is about the intersection between life and art in my own life, in the sense of, I think that for a while I was living a little bit like art was the most important thing to me and life less important in a way. And I think that is not correct because, even if you care about art as the most in your life feeds into your art. And if your life is kind of like not as full as it could be, or not, if you're not happy deep down, or if you're not, fulfilled, or if you're not exploring the things you need to explore, then your art is not going to be what it can be. So even if you claim that art's the most important thing, and you can, but it can never be at the expense of your life. I think that's in a fundamental sense. I think that's what I discovered in that relationship between life and art for me, and that I needed to fully live as well as write and create, and create art, as it were.
So your real life, in your own life, came after studying, exploring art, exploring literature maybe, and then you discovered things in your own life that hadn't been there before.
Yeah, I mean, of course,
because this novel is very much about that, about surprises. Because as you set it on 6 days throughout, so we're going, 1938, 44, I believe, 56, and I can't remember all of them, but it ends in 99, but most of them are pre-war, during the war, immediately after.
Yeah.
Everything changes. The dangers change. The existential dangers, evolve and change. By the way, I love how you capture the immediate post-war England, London especially, with signs of the war just having happened, but already buzzing with new life. So this book is very much about new life, kind of resurrections all over the place, or thinking about them. At each point, so each sort of structural point, on each of those days that you chose, there's a new development, and there's a big change in her life.
Yeah.
And the art sort of becomes something that's in the background. So what I really love about Ivy, and I think that is what your readers will really fall in love with, is how she has talents, but she doesn't know what they are, because she could be a dancer, she could be a painter like her mother, she could write, she can do all that,
Yes.
probably better than most, but it's not her. Something is stopping her
Yes.
from choosing one of those things, and in the end she doesn't do any of them. That's very interesting.
Yes. Yeah.
And also what's very interesting about Ivy is how she perceives the world. I love that. I love how, particularly young Ivy, how she looks at something and she can see that situation in such visual images, visual kind of almost like mini poems of, when she describes her brother's body, when she describes, being on the swing, seeing the garden, the woods, the river, the sky. It's like poetry all around her. Her whole life is like these mini poems, these versions of the world that she sees. And what's outside connects with her inside in such a magical way that young Ivy is full of mystery to me. You just don't know where it will go, and where it goes is surprising, very surprising.
Yes.
And it also is very kind of dictated by her loss. And I will not say which loss.
I know we can't say.
I would
it's
love
difficult.
to zero in on that loss, but the loss starts carving out her various passages and pathways and ways of thinking and rethinking and the relationship with the mother. So I think you've done a fantastic job with this story. And certainly it's surprising, as I said. I mean, certainly this story has a lot of suspense to it, psychologically speaking, but it doesn't dwell on that. You are quite happy to just go deep and leave us with that and then move on. And we can imagine what happens in between. And in that sense, it is not actually, now that I think about it, it's not dissimilar to what you did in your debut, because you leave these fragments with space in between them. But we do fill that space with how we understand it based on what you wrote, what you said. And we do the same in a novel like that, where 6 days separated by so many years. We have to imagine what happened in between. So I think you've done that beautifully. Now, was that something that you planned from the beginning, or did that just sort of happen?
The spaces between.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
the timing.
Yes. I think that what I really wanted to do in this book was to really go deeply into time, as it were, go deeply into almost like a sort of moment, or from moment to moment. So in my previous books, there'd been, particularly in the end we start from, obviously there's a kind of almost like a summary sense. So you're sort of, she's not fully in the sort of passing of time. So I had this sort of sense of like a stream of, people say stream of consciousness, stream of life, kind of like I wanted to be in the stream of life, and I wanted to describe as closely as I could, how it feels to be alive. And that's sort of what I've always wanted to do. I remember as a sort of a teenager thinking that's what I wanted to do. I remember writing something down like create life from life, like create the most lifelike prose that I could make.
Is this what your English teacher noticed and commented on? Megan, write.
I remember I wrote this adaptation of Theseus and the Minotaur, and I remember writing this thing about Ariadne looking out something and the flower framing her view. Anyway, I just remember, I remember these early times of sort of writing and kind of discovering almost what I wanted to do with my writing. I think it's so interesting the way that our lives sort of things change, but then we come back to these same points. And I guess also this is something that I'm exploring in this book. I think it's a sense of, So I wanted to have a sense of being deeply in time, but then I also wanted to set a long span of time. So, I mean, a little bit like I suppose you said about the end we start from, you've got sort of intimacy, the intimate and the epic and the sort of large scale and the small scale. I think you have something similar in a way in Days of Light, because you've got this sort of moment to moment, she's in the garden. How does the grass feel on her feet? How does it feel when she lies down in the grass? What are all the sensations? But then we leap, ahead 10 years. And so we have this sense of like, I guess I really wanted to have a sense of life in that, life is both those really intimate sensual moments and it's that big span of time that, I mean, obviously I'm not, I haven't experienced the whole of life yet, but I guess, recently turned 40 and kind of getting more of a sense of the decades and, and through both my experience and I guess my parents' experience and my children, that sense of time of a bigger space of time and time across the 20th century as well, I guess, because my parents would have, lived through that time and then my grandparents being in the war, in that sense of kind of,
so you drew
of
on
generations.
That.
Yeah, I did draw on that, and that sense that you grow up with of time and of sort of. I think it's interesting this sort of to write about the past. I've never done it before, and I think I'm still quite interested in it. I'm thinking about my next book and wondering whether I'm going to.
Well, I was
set
just
that in
about to ask, what is your next book?
I don't know. Yeah. No? I'm exploring that at the moment, and I think that the question for me is always about the sentence. That's sort of where I start, and so. I do feel that I've sort of it's nice to hear from you that you feel this is very me, this book, and I do sort of feel like I've hit some sort of seam that I would like to. No, I don't mean like a sequel or anything, but some sort of seam in terms of the sentence, I guess.
And Megan, if you were to adapt that, which we probably will, into a film, who would you cast as young Ivy and old Ivy?
Oh, good question.
Just off the top of it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the first person that came to my mind, I suppose, for Ivy was Saoirse Ronan.
Of course, yes.
Young Ivy, I guess, but it could be lots of different people.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, older Ivy. I don't know. I love Jenny Agutter.
Mm-hmm.
I love her.
That makes sense.
No, yeah, there we go.
I'm happy with that. So you can leave us with the image of yourself in your blue shed, writing mostly on your sofa, disconnected from the internet, in a world of your own, and just spinning time and art and life into these wonderful stories.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Megan Hunter, for joining us on Shop Talk with Writers.
Oh, wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Vicky, can you join us for a second, please? Hello. This is Vicky who runs this. We're actually done, but this is Megan Hunter.
Hello, lovely to meet
Vicky,
you.
who runs this, and she was admiring your books. And I was wondering if you'd like to tell us how you choose your books.
So I guess probably quite randomly in some respects. A lot of it we lean very much into our own sort of personal taste, but given that they're very eclectic anyway, then that's quite straightforward, quite simple. Recommendations, of course. But
you seem incredibly well informed. Like you have very current books. You also have like very special books, historically interesting books, art books.
I would say that everything, there are tenuous links through them all. So it could very well be that just one author that we've just got into, and then you're sort of reading up on them and who influenced them, and then suddenly you've got a recommendation for someone else, or suddenly you get something from their writing that sort of tells you about their philosophy, and suddenly you get into looking into that philosophy, the history behind sort of what they're writing, why they're writing it. So any number of things.
Maybe really Megan, is there anything you'd recommend for this particular bookshop?
I was just noticing Rural Hours, Harriet Baker. I really enjoyed that, and I know she just won Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year. And that's I actually love kind of group biographies. I really love that sense of kind of comparing different writers. And she writes about Virginia Woolf and also Rosamund Lehman. I'm forgetting the other one who she writes about. But yeah, she writes about different writers and how they experience kind of living in the countryside and different points of their lives and kind of and even things like shopping lists and and I suppose that's relevant to my book in the sense of you sort of the minutiae of daily life and how that feeds into literature and art and so I would recommend that book. And there's lots of books here that I really want to read. And I'm very tempted. And you've got some amazing early editions of Virginia Woolf.
Which some of which you have. You have some. I
have that to the lighthouse with the Vanessa Bell. Beautiful. I am pretty keen on. I don't really collect books or anything, but I'd like to.
No, it's a dangerous habit, but wonderful. Lovely. One of the things that we really got into was so writers like Natalia Ginzburg. So you've got fiction and non-fiction in Fitzcarraldo do that brilliantly as well. So you've got so many writers. I can't think of any off the top of my head now, of course. But where you do get a taste of them, sort of writing sort of extremely. Sort of just gutsy writing, and then others that really seem to reveal very much more about their processes, the whats, the whys, their philosophies, and so Ginsberg particularly, I think we're a real massive fan of Natalia Ginzburg. Real revelation.
I did remember because of course it's Sylvia Townsend Warner, who I love. And another recommendation I could make was Lolly Willows, just in general. So that's the other writer that she writes about in Rural Hours. She's a wonderful writer. But yes, Natalia Ginzburg, fantastic. I completely agree. I think we have overlapping taste for sure. And I'll be telling everyone about this place because it's so wonderful. There's such an amazing smell as well. I think the food seems amazing.
Actually, Vicky, can I just ask you, give us a little description of this place. What is it about? Because I love it and I talk about it, but tell us how did this happen and why do you love it?
The how it happened is an extremely long story, and in many respects it's probably part of it has got a 20 plus year history so with Andrea and how he came into the sort of the whole food side of what happens here, which is sort of a very core part of what this space is about. It's evolved so very much. I think we collectively have about 25 years together in this space. So I was working downstairs for quite some time in the garden centre and so on, but there's something about the space that is just, it really kind of calls for it to be really immersed in. And it's what are you immersing in while you're immersing in it? So it's got to be very 360. It's food and it's.
Do people actually buy books when they come here?
Yeah. I mean, it's something
when they come
that
here to sneeze.
Yeah. So it's a very strange thing. So it's something that it's always very unexpected. So we've had some real sort of shocked faces when they get to the top of the stairs and sort of find this here because it's not what you're sort of anticipating when you're walking through the garden centre, as you say, sort of passing by the packets of seeds and things. But we've had the most wonderful reactions, people saying it's like walking into Narnia, or it really is that kind of you just don't know what's on the other side of it. And the nice thing is that when you do get to the other side, you can kind of just take in what you want to take in. So, we love that people sit and really engage with anything and everything that's in and around the space. And whether that's sort of, while they're waiting for their food, they pop up and browse the books and possibly pick them up and buy them.
We should add that we are sitting here surrounded by antiques and paintings and silver and glass and crystal and art and, wonderful furniture. So it really has an atmosphere that's very unusual, so much so that Megan just said she completely forgot that she was being interviewed, that it was being recorded.
That's amazing.
We were just chatting and that's how it feels. And I've never left this place without buying a book or 10.
I do say that I think we ought to do a line in Blinkers because often people sort of like get rather sort of wrapped up and say, okay, we really were supposed to be popping in for a coffee. Suddenly we've had, a full meal, bought books. Been sort of like delving into our curios and paintings and things, and had great conversation and actually sort of spent nice time together as well. And I think that's the thing. It's very much more for us. The sum of its parts it's much more than that. It's everything together and the experience that we want people to
So
have.
in addition to thanking Megan for the conversation, I'd like to thank Pritchard and Ure for allowing us to record here and sit here and enjoy this place. And we'd really like to recommend it to anyone who loves books and good food and amazing cakes as well.
Thank you.
Say
It's
that.
absolute pleasure, and
Thank you.
welcome to New Space.
So this is Camden Garden Centre in Camden, of course. Come and enjoy. Thank you both.
Thank you.
This was Shop Talk with Writers. Our guest today was novelist Megan Hunter. Her new novel, Days of Light, is published by Pritchard Ure. I'm Elena Lapin. Please find and support the podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Instagram and read more on my Substack, elenalapin.substack.com, where this podcast is generated. Thank you to Pritchard and Ure for the lovely and yummy setting to record this conversation. Thank you for listening.